Hi, welcome. We're going to get started. I'm Debbie with the Diverse and Empowered Employees of Portland, and very excited. I wasn't planning on introducing, so Carolyn, will you be introducing, or Jeff? Okay, so I just wanted to thank everyone who pre-ordered Dr. Yamazaki's book, Children of the Atomic Bomb. They did arrive, and he's already autographed them. So those of you that did pre-order, they're in the back. You can pick them up. If not, I'm inter-officing them to you. If people didn't get in on the order, I am willing to make another order. They will not be autographed though. So just come see me in the back afterwards, and we can order another book for you. Thank you.
Hi everybody, I'm Jeff Selby with the Office of Equity and Human Rights, and I'd like to thank DEEP, Diverse and Empowered Employees of Portland, for inviting me to help out today, and thank you all for spending your lunchtime with us. We're going to have a great hour with Dr. James Yamazaki, and to kind of give some background and maybe fill in some blanks before we start, we thought we'd show a nice piece that KGW did with Dr. Yamazaki. So we'll start off with that, and then we'll jump into the interview, and then we'll take some questions after that. So we'll have the video right now.
70 years ago this weekend, the U.S. dropped the first atomic bombs on Japan. If you're of a certain age, you remember the duck and cover drills we used to do in school to protect us in the event of nuclear attack. But those days are long gone, with younger generations seemingly worried about a host of other things. In tonight's Cup of Joe, we sit down with a man who thinks about the possibility of nuclear war every day. And he thinks you should, too.
The ground zero would probably be up here somewhere.
At age 99, Dr. James Yamazaki has seen things most of us can only imagine. Where do we start? He has not only lived through, but actually been a part of some of the most critical chapters in world history, including one that would shape his life, the U.S. atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
It's unbelievable the strength of that blast.
James Yamazaki was born in Los Angeles. His parents had moved from Japan to California in the early 1900s. He graduated from UCLA and went to medical school in the Midwest. But all signs pointed to the U.S. joining World War II. It was imminent, so he enlisted in the Army. He got his papers 1 week before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
I said, my God, Japan really did what we feared it might do something.
In another twist, like many Japanese Americans, Yamazaki's parents were locked up in internment camps while their son was preparing to fight for the United States. Once he finished med school, he arrived in Europe in 1944 as a combat surgeon. Within weeks, he found himself in the middle of a major German offensive. He had walked right into what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge.
Our outfit got really hammered. Out of 10,000, 7,000 were casualties within a week. So, God, the place is just littered with casualties.
Yamazaki was captured and held for the next 6 months, in his words, straggling along without food, walking hundreds of miles with his German captors, and somehow surviving U.S. bombing raids.
And I remember the German guards slamming the door to our train, and they ran for the air raid shelter. I remember, so nice to be alive.
You thought you were going to die?
Yeah, because the bomb was falling all over us.
An unbelievable nightmare. That experience gave the young doctor a unique perspective on what it's like to be bombed, and it would come into play once the war ended. Blown off the face of the earth. After Yamazaki's release and victory in Europe Day, he arrived back in the States just in time for another historic day. The U.S. dropping an atomic bomb, first on Hiroshima, then 3 days later on Nagasaki.
I can't conceive myself being in such a situation.
But soon enough, he would be at ground zero. In 1949, the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission invited him to go to Nagasaki to study the impact of those bombs on women who were pregnant at the time and their babies.
Children that were born, they encountered stillbirth, neonatal death, and children who survived developed what we call a small head and mental retardation and seizures.
Survivors literally painted a graphic picture of what happened under the mushroom cloud. Yamazaki also heard from local doctors who lived to tell stories of the roaring fire and the fallout that followed.
It cremates them in the form that they were there at the moment. So if they were carrying a baby, it was over just standing.
The bombings ended World War II, but left 2 cities in ruins and generations suffering from cancer and other effects of radiation poisoning. Some 150,000 died in Hiroshima and 80,000 in Nagasaki, both considered conservative estimates.
Do you think people still don't understand?
Of course, they don't, yeah. No, I don't think they do. How could you understand the death of 80,000 lives at an instant?
What he saw over his year and a half in Nagasaki fueled his research for the next 5 decades. The pediatrician became an expert on the subject and wrote a book.
Yeah, this is not Nagasaki.
While he won't say the decision to drop the bombs was wrong, he uses his influence to tell anyone who will listen, this cannot happen again. He uses 9/11 as an example. Introduce one of today's nuclear weapons into that equation, and there would be a 10-mile circle of devastation, possibly millions dead, and radioactive fallout that would spread for 200 miles. As he approaches his 100th year on this planet, a worst-case scenario, all-out nuclear war, is something he doesn't even want to imagine. For now, he wants to see future generations learn more about what he's seen firsthand, because he says it's their lives that are at risk. His only hope is that if that time comes again, ration and reason will trump everything else.
What would you like to see happen with the stockpile of weapons we do have?
For the elimination complete. It is thousands, we have thousands. God, you only need one to cause all the devastation you'd ever want to see. And we have thousands. There's no reason to keep them.
If you want to learn more about Dr. Yamazaki's life and his book, we've posted a link on kgw.com.
Wow. It's hard to determine where to begin. We have to cover 99 years of your life for the rest of the hour. But let me begin by thanking you for being here. We're so blessed and lucky to have you here to tell your story. I know being part of the Japanese American community with the history that we have with our veterans and our elders, that it's hard for them to tell their story. So we're very lucky to have you here to share with us. So thank you. So being an American of Japanese ancestry, how were you treated as a youth before World War II?
Well, we lived in a segregated community, and we didn't have any direct confrontation. We did have one interesting thing. My father was a minister, and he wanted to build a church for the young people that were growing up. And the community objected. And but then I first got my first input of how things work in the United States. There was a posters pasted on the walls that this church would decrease the value of property in the area. and so it should be built. And there was quite an active movement in the community, putting posters on the telephone poles. My brother and I would get up early in the morning and take down these posters. But of interest to us was how things work in this country. This came to the attention of the community, and the court issued a writ. I knew nothing about writ, but it was a writ of mandamus, and it said that there's no reason that this church should be built. It will increase the citizenship of the new immigrants coming here. And so the writ of mandamus was issued, and the building of the community church was resulted in a nice church in the community.
How did the attack on Pearl Harbor change your life? I know your parents were two of more than 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry who were put into American concentration camps. Tell us how the attack on Pearl Harbor changed your life and your family's life.
Well, we were, before Pearl Harbor, winds of war were getting quite active, and at home we discussed how should we prepare for the coming outbreak of war. And my father felt that our future home in the United States would be more likely if we enlisted in the armed forces, as the other boys, Jones and Smith boys, did. And so I put in my papers for the armed forces, and I received my commission 1 week before Pearl Harbor.
So tell us about that. You have your commission now. You are an officer in the United States Army.
Reserve, yes.
In reserve. And then the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
Take us through that time.
Well, I was in a boarding school at the medical school, Mom Brown's boarding house. With just a nice Irish widow that had a house full of students, and other students made no particular. Here's another guy, G.I. Joe.
Okay.
Yeah.
So during World War II, you were assigned to a non-segregated unit. How were you treated?
I was their doc. By then I was 28, and all the young guys were 17, 18, just almost like an uncle.
Wow.
You know, so if they had any complaints, they'd show up at the dispensary. So before we went overseas, I was their doc.
Wow. And so even that though you were assigned to a non-segregated unit, was it mostly a good experience with your fellow soldiers?
Yeah, it's just, in fact, another doctor that came into the service at the same time, became good friends, and he got sent overseas before I did, and after the war, we renewed our friendship, and their kids show up at our house all the time in different parts of the country.
Wow, great. I mentioned earlier that your parents were in an American concentration camp during the war. How was that experience? You visited them as a soldier?
Yeah. My father was, as a minister, he had come to this country early in the 1900s and went to school in New Haven, Connecticut, and at Trinity College, and then went to the divinity school at Yale University. So he was convinced that this was a good place to be our home. And eventually he became pastor to the Japanese community in LA. And he focused on the younger generation, that's our generation, that God and country was the focus of our living in the United States. He came to this country in 1900 at the opening of the century, one of the earliest immigrants from Japan. And through his school at Yale and New Haven, he was convinced that this is where we should make our home.
I see.
And being he being one of the first Japanese to come to this country, we would be the oldest of the next generation.
Right.
And he said we had to take care of the generation coming. And so all the time I was at UCLA, I was the scoutmaster for a troop of 30 kids.
Wow. Wow. You know, it's amazing. You hear so many folks whose lives were affected by the incarceration of Japanese Americans, and how you hear this very common thread of patriotism to a country that locked them up.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It really is. You were a prisoner of war for 6 months.
Yeah.
You served with Kurt Vonnegut. Tell us about that whole experience of being a prisoner of war. I can't imagine what that would have been like.
Well, I think there's a lot to tell, and if you really want to know the details, you should read Kurt Vonnegut's book, because he writes so well. I flunked it. Dummy English at UCLA, had to take it a second time, still flunked. So
Really?
my writing really.
So you hired Kurt Vonnegut to write your story. Yeah? Slaughterhouse 5, right?
I was just as fortunate in getting a real good friend, Lou Fleming, to help us writing the book. He was, just to tell you how lucky I was, he was on the editorial staff of the LA Times.
Oh, okay. Well,
Having a friend like that
yeah,
helps in writing a book.
I guess so.
Yeah.
Well, you made a joke about your English studies. You're the one signing books today. So,
So thanks to Lou Fleming.
yeah. Anything else you could share about that time? I mean, what was going through your head when you were a prisoner of war? What kept you going? What was your inspiration?
I guess my wife. Yeah. We were married just in the same year that I got captured. So I think that was, I guess, kept me going.
Wow. We are quickly moving through your life here. What did you do yesterday? No. Could you share with us what was it like to be the lead physician of the U.S. atomic bomb medical team that was assigned to Nagasaki to survey the effects of the bomb? I understand Hiroshima declined to have you assigned there also, but please tell us about that experience as being part of that team.
I was assigned to Japan without any specific job title or anything. Just in Washington, the National Academy said I would be the pediatrician to support any studies going there. But one of the things when I accepted the recruiting job, was that I would make sure that I had a appropriate place to live. And the reason for that was, even though I returned from overseas as a POW, I had we couldn't find a place to stay because whenever we replied to want ads for our places, to stay, when they saw us, they said, oh, that house is taken or we don't have it for you.
Mhm.
So when I took the job when I considered taking the job from Japan, I said, I want to make sure we had a place for our family.
Mhm.
But when we arrived in Japan, even though we were assured we had a place to live, the occupation of Japan was divided into sections, and the British occupied the Hiroshima area. And they had a very definite detail about who could stay in their place, and they would not allow people of Japanese descent to stay in their housing area. But that was the only place I could stay.
Mm.
So of course I raised an objection.
Sure, sure.
Next thing I knew, I was assigned to Nagasaki, where there was no housing area that was designated for the Americans.
Mhm.
In fact, when I got there, I was the only representing the United States, and they said, we lost the word, and we'd find housing for you. And they obtained one of the nicest homes in Nagasaki for us to stay in.
Oh, wow.
There was no other designated housing areas.
Right.
And the governor's general attitude was, won the war,
Mm-hmm.
and he didn't mean it in a derogatory way, but that was his attitude.
Sure.
And we had no problems in Nagasaki.
Mhm. How did you feel being a Japanese American and now being in Japan for this role?
Well, we had to let them know what our mission was.
Mhm.
And our mission was to study the outcome of what the survivors who was exposed to the radiation of the bomb.
Mhm.
And when we explained that to the doctors of the medical school, which was just 800 meters from ground zero,
Mhm.
they were just as anxious to conduct such a study. And at that time, they didn't have funds to carry out the study.
Mhm.
On the other hand, they were the ones that were right there. And so a collaborative study was initiated,
Mhm.
which is still studied still going on today. But they have identified 100,000 survivors, and the long-term effects of the bomb is being studied by a joint team of U.S. and Japan medical teams.
Mhm. Did that prompt you to write the book, Children of the Atomic Bomb?
And it probably had something, yes.
Mhm.
Some friends, physics professor at Boston U, thought it would be worthwhile documenting our initiating the studies.
Mhm. You know, I asked earlier about your Japanese ancestry
Yeah,
and then going to Japan in this role as a U.S. soldier.
yeah.
You know, I grew up in Indiana. I was the only Asian kid in my school.
Yeah.
And everyone was like, he's so Japanese, right? And then when I went to Japan years later, I felt, I'm really Indiana. I mean, I'm so Indiana, you know, when I'm in Japan. How did that feel for you, being a Yamazaki American in Japan at that time?
You could, my grandmother came from Japan when we were 5 years old, so we did learn kids' language.
Mhm.
And so when I went to Japan and brought an interpreter to the medical school saying what we would like to make this, engage in this study, I brought an interpreter with me. And the doctor in charge said, hey, Yamazaki, his English is so poor, Your Japanese might be better. And so I got there and I had no choice but to get up and do my spiel.
Mm-hmm.
And it just cracked them up to hear my Japanese.
Better than mine, I'm sure.
It broke the ice and we were on good terms after that. Had a very cordial relationship with them.
Yeah, I guess the last name helps
Yeah.
as well.
And we also had a very nice mentor, that guy visiting us, who was right there at the time of all this.
Right. I can only imagine, you know, they know that the United States is sending, you know, the most qualified person for this role. And then,
No, I wouldn't quite put it that
Really?
way.
I know you probably wouldn't, you know, I think other people might. And-
We knew nothing
Yeah.
about the bombing.
Mhm.
That was all kids, yeah.
But there's a reason you were sent. Because of your knowledge of, and your medical skill, I'm assuming?
No,
No?
I think they're taking their chances.
Just taking a chance.
They really didn't know too much about me,
Right.
except for my record.
Right. Mhm. So you're sent because of your record, and then you show up, and the Japanese are now introducing themselves to a person named Yamazaki, which I
Right.
think is fascinating. Yeah. Okay. You've done so much with this work on studying the effects of the atomic bomb and radiation. What are you the most proud of in your work?
Wouldn't say proud of, it's just that I was fortunate to have this experience in Japan. Then at UCLA, we were very fortunate in getting together a group of men both in nuclear medicine and in anatomy of the brain. And for 12 years, we had a team that did radiation studies to relate it to the Japan studies, especially on the developing brain.
Is it hard for you to admit that you're proud of something? I
I
think it's a common thread, and whenever I speak
don't
to
know
Nikkei
why that
elders,
got in. I don't know how that got into the discussion.
because I'm asking questions and I'm in charge. Well, there are many people who are proud of your work. You've done some amazing things, and you know, certainly the book that you wrote really tells a compelling story. When will you be 100? When is your birthday?
July 6th.
July 6th, you'll be 100 years old.
Yeah.
Okay. And you're healthier than me, which is amazing.
I don't know much about it.
So you've lived through 2 world wars, you've seen amazing changes in technology. What's better nowadays when you think about everything? What has improved in our lives that we have now that you didn't have when you were growing up?
It's hard to say. Well, what worries me is that we have a couple thousand nuclear weapons that, and not only us, but people in North Korea and in Pakistan, India, China. There's a pretty big cauldron of nuclear weapons. And just how to keep the lid on that
Right,
for future generation is certainly concerns me.
right, absolutely. How do you think we were better off back in the old days? Were things better back then than they are now, in your opinion, on certain things?
That's hard to say.
Yeah, okay,
Mhm.
sure. Okay. Okay, you're going to be 100 in July. Your father lived to be 101. What's your secret? What's your family, you know, do you have a family secret? What do you attribute to your health and longevity?
I don't know. I just wake up in the morning, it's one more day.
Yeah. All right. No secrets, huh? And if you are, you're not sharing them. Okay, all right. How do you like living in the Pacific Northwest? You live in Stevenson, I believe? Is that-
White salmon.
Oh, okay.
White salmon.
White salmon. How do you like it there?
It's okay.
Yeah?
Miss California, the weather and all that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay. Well, like I said, there's a very brief kind of rundown of things that, highlights that we wanted to talk to you about. We also wanted to leave room for questions from the audience. Is that okay?
Sure.
All right. So, does anyone have a question? Yes, in the back, please.
I've been in Japan for the observances of the bombing days, when there is silence and reflection. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how, in this country, what we might do, if anything, to focus on the threat of bombs?
Yeah, well, of course, I'm very much in line with your thinking, what can we do? And I just think that students, before they finish at least their high school, should have a fairly clear idea of what nuclear weapon does. That just in a flash, say like in Nagasaki, 70,000 lives were lost. And it certainly weighs on my mind that we don't have a program in our educational system that we live in a world with weapons, and that if they use the nuclear weapons, this is the kind of effect we will see. And yet every day we hear of bombings of large populations. And what is it that divides a country, whatever country, from dropping the so-called regular bomb, TNT bomb, from a nuclear bomb? And not that the regular TNT bombs are very frightening. I survived one, and I'm glad to be alive. So I hope, I wonder if you have some ideas how we could teach our kids, or instill in, or have in our educational program at least a basic understanding of the weapons we use in war, especially the nuclear weapons.
Thank you.
I visited Hiroshima in the 90s and saw the Peace Memorial in the museum, and it's everyone should be able to see what the consequences are of that type of weapon.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. Yes, sir.
So, was there much way to help the survivors of the nuclear weapons in Japan, help them with respect to their problems associated with long-term radiation exposure, long-term problems associated with radiation exposure?
Well, the most outstanding effect that one could put your finger on is the development of cancer. Yeah. And that women are much more sensitive to radiation than men by almost 5 times. Say if one took cancer in the survivors comparing the two genders.
And there wasn't much to do to try to reduce that probability, prevent it, or?
Pardon me?
Was there anything that could be done after the war to reduce the chance of someone getting cancer? Radiation?
Once the radiation hits your system, that's it. Yeah. But the other thing is that the younger the individual, the more likely to develop cancer. So it's women and age are the two determining factors of cancer survivors. Though now with there's an ongoing study of 100,000 survivors of, by the doctors of both Japan and the United States. That's been continuous. And they have found that the children are the most sensitive next to women, especially in, not only in cancer, but other diseases too.
Yes, I have a question in the back.
Yes, how long were you in Nagasaki? And obviously, the radiation didn't seem to have, maybe it's helped your age, but
Pardon me?
how long were you in Nagasaki, and were you metered while you were there? Were you did you wear a dosimeter?
Oh, no, no, I didn't wear any radiation monitor.
Okay.
When the bomb dropped, the bomb exploded at an elevation of 1,000 feet, 1,000 meters, whereas if the bomb had dropped on the ground, the nuclear material would have mixed with the soil and spread a lot of fallout, radioactive fallout. But as the bomb dropped at 1,000 feet, there wasn't this fallout of a significant amount where the entire population was radiated significantly. There were small amounts, but not much. And so while we were there, a team of radiation experts came and monitored the soil, the eaves, and the rivers, and determined the amount of radiation that was remained. But there wasn't a significant amount. And they have now many years ago, they developed a instrument called a whole body counter, where they could put the body into this monitor and determine how much radiation would remain in the individuals. And in Nagasaki, the residual radiation in the survivors, there isn't just hardly a measurable effect.
Yes, Dante?
Did you see any generational carryover from the survivors to their children from any of the fallout?
Well, that was one of the major concern of the scientists was the effect, genetic effect, and so the initial study was studies involved examining the infants born to the mothers, and at that time there was no congenital malformation or other defects, that health defects that could be ascribed to the radiation. So that was a carefully done study of the first generation of children. Now that doesn't mean that there is none, because these individuals worry what the genetic effect might be transferred and developed at some future date in not in the immediate generation, but it might skip generation and show effects so that the total effect could be spread over many generations. The parents are concerned about that.
Yes.
Dr. Yamazaki, have you been asked to speak before the United Nations
Yes, we
about your
did,
concerns? And what was their response to you?
Well, it was a session in which the whole theme of the United Nations studies, the meetings were how could we nuclear weapons.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Were there any steps that were taken that seemed promising at the time, or is it done? Is it gone?
Well, it hasn't continued, yes. It was quite an active movement at that time, street parades and all that kind of stuff. But
When was that?
gosh,
2010?
something like that.
So, who would you recommend that we stir up in order to revive this? Do you have recommendations on where we should direct this?
This kind of thing isn't easy to, with all the other kind of health problems that we focus on, but I just think that possibly we should develop a program in our educational system so that by the time you finish high school, you'll have a broad understanding of radiation effects and effects of nuclear weapons. I was just wondering just how we could invoke such a studies in our
Are there
curriculum.
documents that can be that can be tailored for that?
I'm sure it shouldn't take too much effort to do that.
Is there a body of would it be the people you've worked with? Is there an existing body of people that we could support?
Well, of course, you have all scientific information for the government is entrusted to the national academies, and they have committees for these radiation effects, and certainly they would be the ones that would be the main support for development such as curriculum.
Isn't there
Let's see if we, pardon me? Yeah, we'll go with someone behind you and then you.
You mentioned concerns about the
I can't hear you.
intergenerational.
I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
You mentioned concerns about the effects of the radiation continuing for more than one generation. Are the Japanese and American governments continuing the studies of the descendants of the people affected by the bombs?
Yes, there's ever since the time of the bombing, there's been a joint U.S.-Japan studies right now called the Radiation Effects Research Foundation. And they have identified 100,000 survivors in which they could locate their position and the symptoms they developed at the time of the bombing. And that's the base population that is being followed.
But are they following the descendants of those survivors who were born after the bombing?
Or that study is, right now, there is one study in which children of the subsequent generation is being examined.
Did you have a follow-up, sir?
Well, there's, as I recall, biological effects of ionizing radiation is a series of studies published by NAS, is that right?
Yes,
And that is one body of knowledge about just the general subject of the effect of radiation on humans,
yes,
right?
or continuing committee following that, yeah. And they oversee the studies in Japan.
Yes.
And with the joint
What are your thoughts
group
about
from Japan.
Oh, sorry. Pardon me? No, please continue.
No, just to answer your question, scientists in both countries are involved in collating the information.
Okay.
Yes.
Dr. Yamazaki, what are your thoughts about nuclear energy?
Pardon me?
What are your thoughts about nuclear energy?
In what regards? Such a big scope.
You mean as far as power goes?
Is it
As
safe?
far as developing nuclear power plants?
such a broad subject. We had a power plant in California, and it was right near the ocean, and one of the problems, or one of the discussions that arose was what they should do about this nuclear power plant. And it was right. San Diego was only maybe 30, 40 miles away. And then Santa Ana wasn't too much further. And so there was quite a public discussion of what might happen in some accident that might develop. And they were also concerned about the public safety from some military event that they had that might develop. And so they eventually closed the nuclear power plant. Then there was another nuclear power plant in California that was right on the earthquake line, and they finally closed that one. So I don't know what other plants nearby Los Angeles right now. I don't think there are any.
Just a
Yeah, please.
Just a tangent is, actually, there's someone else here who'd be better to speak, but there's gonna be meetings about Hanford this week.
This is Caroline Yamazaki, by the
Yeah.
way, Dr. Yamazaki's daughter.
And so, they have a working plant out there at Hanford, and it's a sister, reactor to the one in Fukushima. And the fault line is only about 3 miles away, 3-4 miles away, and the fault line that, from the Fukushima one was 30 miles away. So if you want to go to those meetings for Riverkeeper about Hanford, that's one thing you could do. And as far as nuclear and radiation, the Nagasaki bomb, the fuel was created in Hanford. And
Right
it's
in our backyard.
leaking and getting close to the river, so that's my part.
I know the Physicians for Social Responsibility are very much a group that has raised a lot of the issues of Hanford. Yeah. Yes?
And I'm the Hanford coordinator with Columbia Riverkeeper, so we can talk with me afterwards.
Great.
If you're curious.
Okay,
I also work for the city of Portland.
thank you. Any other questions for Dr. Yamazaki? Yes, sir?
The two bombs that were dropped, one on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were actually different fuels that they used. They used plutonium in one, uranium in the other. Were the cancers and birth defects extremely similar between the two? Or were there differences?
So he said there were different, the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were different types of nuclear fuel. Were the effects on the victims similar? Is that a fair representation of your question?
The birth defects and the cancers, were they similar, or were there differences in?
As far as the development of the effects of radiation, there is none. But the Hiroshima is in a very flat plateau, what would you call it, a delta, and so that the effect was quite widespread, but also diluted in its involvement. Whereas Nagasaki bomb was in a valley 2 miles long and 1 mile wide, so it had a more concentrated effect. And you could not only identify that 70,000 lives were lost immediately, but you could identify the locations of the effects at different distance from ground zero.
Sir, you had a question?
We're just curious about the effects on the environment, the flora and the fauna of Nagasaki and Hiroshima were after the maybe 10 or 20, 30 years later? Was anything noted?
Of course, they were quite concerned about that. They were happy to see vegetation didn't change much in the year following. And they did have groups go in from the United States to study the residual radiation and what it did on the environment.
We have time for 2 more questions, yes?
Yeah, in your book, you talked about when you were in Nagasaki doing your work, that there was the North Korean conflict, there was a Korean War, and you got asked to go to a meeting to talk about the effects of Nagasaki and Hiroshima and what you were seeing in the people. And I was just wondering a little bit about that meeting. It seemed like maybe the government was planning to maybe drop a bomb on Korea, and we haven't dropped a bomb since that, so it must have been a really good meeting and very effective. So I'm just wondering a little bit about that, and if the American government at that point realized that, we should be
Well,
doing
there was
this.
quite a furor about dropping the bomb during the Korean War between MacArthur and the President, Truman. And I think it was MacArthur the one that was encouraging some studies for the use of the bomb, whereas Truman was very much against using a nuclear bomb on a population.
Yes, Joe?
Dr. Yamazaki, do you think that we as a society have become desensitized in this sense? Because, we use acronyms like WDMs now to talk about nuclear weapons. And it seems to me that we've become, with the media the way that it is nowadays, and the generations now, it's been, how many years, and young people growing up now have no connection, and realization to what's going on. And I really appreciate and applaud the idea of education to this. But do you think as a society we've become desensitized to this potential impacts?
Well, unfortunately, war keeps going, and each day we hear about bombing, and we don't relate those bombing to nuclear weapons, but anyone who have experienced bombing itself, it's quite a scary stuff, and quite lethal. And all the bombing that goes on right now in Syria and elsewhere nearby is, I think, we don't consider that in our thinking too much of effects and comparing it to nuclear weapons. It might be a good time to have discussions about that right now.
Well, Dr. Yamazaki, as a Japanese American combat veteran who is also an advocate for peace, it's just been an amazing pleasure and honor for me to interview you today. And I know that you aren't able to fulfill all interview requests, and we're so honored to have you accept the invitation from DEEP today to be with us. So thank you so much for your time. You're a true hero for everything you've done in your work, and another Japanese American hero from the Northwest will be honored next week at the White House, Min Yasui. And if you know anything about Min, he's quite a hero not only in this part of the country but also in Denver. And I also want to recognize the folks in DEEP. I'm not sure if we have everyone here, but we certainly have Carolyn, who was instrumental in putting this together today, and Angie and Debbie. Where folks from DEEP, raise your hand, and Greg.